The gavel hit once, and in that single sound, a woman lost everything she thought was hers. Stay with me, because what happened in the next 10 minutes turned a quiet auction into something no one in that room would ever forget. Charlotte Whitmore didn't faint because she was weak. She fainted because the moment finally caught up with her, the weight of betrayal, the shock of recognition, and the life growing inside her reacting all at once. But that's not how the room saw it. They saw a pregnant woman in a pale silk dress collapse onto polished marble, her hand instinctively protecting her belly as murmurs rippled through a crowd dressed in black tuxedos and diamond smiles. No one rushed to her immediately. 50 people stood there, watching, calculating, whispering. The chandelier above cast a cold, white light that made everything feel staged, like a scene rehearsed too many times. 10 minutes earlier, Charlotte had been standing near the back of the room, fingers trembling just enough to betray what she was trying to hide. The auction house smelled like polished wood and expensive perfume, the kind of place where history was reduced to price tags. On the velvet display at the center of the stage rested the last thing her mother had ever given her, a delicate heirloom necklace, its intricate crest catching the light in a way that felt almost alive. She hadn't even known it was here until the catalog appeared that morning. Lot number 37. Estate jewelry, origin unknown. Unknown. That word echoed louder than the auctioneer's voice. Because Charlotte knew exactly where it came from, even if she never understood why it mattered so much. Do I hear 50,000? The auctioneer called, his tone practiced, effortless. A hand went up. Then another. The numbers climbed quickly, casually, like it was nothing more than a game. Charlotte's breath shortened, her pulse sinking with each bid. Across the room, Daniel Whitmore stood with one hand in his pocket, expression calm, detached. He didn't look at her. Not once. To everyone else, he was the composed millionaire managing his assets. To Charlotte, he was the man who had just decided her past was expendable. 75,000. 80. The gavel hovered, suspended in a moment that felt longer than it should. Charlotte took a step forward, her voice barely finding its way out. That piece isn't for sale. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was enough to turn heads. For a brief second, the room acknowledged her existence. Daniel exhaled slowly, like she had just inconvenienced him. Everything has a price, he said, not unkindly, but without warmth. The words landed heavier than they should have. Because in that moment, Charlotte realized he wasn't talking about the necklace. The bidding continued. The gavel came down. Sold. And just like that, the last piece of her history slipped into someone else's hands. Something inside her shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. Her hand moved to her stomach, feeling a sudden, sharp awareness of the life she carried. The baby stirred, as if reacting to something she couldn't yet name. Around her, the room returned to its rhythm, conversations resuming, glasses clinking softly. No one noticed the way Charlotte's vision blurred, or how the edges of the world seemed to fold inward. Except one person. Near the front, a woman in her 60s froze mid-step, her gaze locked not on Charlotte's face, but on the empty space where the necklace had been. Her hand trembled slightly, as if she had just seen a ghost. And in that brief, fragile moment before Charlotte collapsed, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, disbelief, and a truth that hadn't yet been spoken out loud. The first sound Charlotte heard when she came back was not a voice but a rhythm, soft and mechanical, like a distant heartbeat trying to anchor her back to the room she had just escaped, and when her eyes opened the ceiling above her looked unfamiliar, too white, too still, until the memory rushed in all at once and her breath caught sharply as her hand moved instantly to her stomach, feeling for movement, waiting, and then there it was. A small steady response that grounded her more than anything else could, and only then did she realize she was no longer on the marble floor but resting on a velvet chaise near the side of the auction hall, slightly removed from the crowd that had already begun to pretend nothing had happened, because that is what rooms like this do, they absorb discomfort and replace it with polite silence. You should not be standing in here, a voice said quietly beside her, low and controlled, and Charlotte turned her head slowly to see the same older woman. From before, the one whose eyes had not left the necklace, now standing closer, studying her with a kind of focus that felt almost unsettling. "I am fine," Charlotte managed, though her voice did not fully cooperate, and she tried to sit up straighter, to reclaim some sense of composure, but the weight in her chest remained, heavier than before, because now it was not just loss, it was the certainty that something irreversible had just happened. Across the room Daniel was already speaking with a group of investors, his posture relaxed, one hand gesturing lightly as if the past 10 minutes had been nothing more than a routine transaction, and when Charlotte's eyes found him, he still did not look back, not even by accident, as if acknowledging her would disrupt the version of reality he had already decided to move forward with. "That necklace," the woman continued, her voice dropping slightly as if the words themselves carried significance. "Where did you get it?" And Charlotte hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she had never needed to explain it before. It had always just existed, part of her life without question. "It was my mother's," she said finally, her fingers curling slightly against the fabric of her dress. "She gave it to me when I was younger." The woman's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the answer confirmed something she had already suspected, and for a moment she said nothing, just studied Charlotte's face. Her posture, the way she carried herself even now, fragile on the surface but holding something deeper underneath, something that did not quite match the story everyone else in the room believed. "And she told you nothing else?" the woman asked, carefully, and Charlotte shook her head slowly, confusion beginning to mix with the lingering shock, because the question itself felt misplaced, as if it belonged to a different conversation entirely. "No," she said, quieter this time, and the woman inhaled, steadying herself as if preparing to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. But before she could continue, a staff member approached with a polite but firm tone, informing Charlotte that the buyer had already requested immediate transfer of the piece and any personal claims would need to be handled through legal channels. The words were delivered professionally, almost kindly, but they carried a finality that made Charlotte's stomach tighten again, because the necklace was already gone, already beyond her reach, and the room had already decided it was never truly hers to begin with. And as the staff member stepped away, the woman beside her straightened slightly, her eyes hardening with a resolve that had not been there moments ago. "This is not over," she said, not loudly, not for anyone else to hear, but with a certainty that cut through the noise of the room, and for the first time since the gavel fell, Charlotte felt something shift again, not fear, not grief, but the faint, unfamiliar beginning of something else, something that had been buried for years and was only now starting to surface, because whatever that necklace represented, it was no longer just a memory, it was a question, and someone in that room already knew the answer. The room did not change, but Charlotte felt it differently now, as if every polished surface and whispered conversation carried a second meaning just beneath what was visible, and as she slowly rose to her feet the woman beside her did not offer assistance, not out of indifference, but because she seemed to understand that this moment required Charlotte to stand on her own. "Walk with me," the woman said quietly, turning toward a quieter corridor that ran along the edge of the auction hall. Away from the soft clinking of glasses and the low murmur of wealth exchanging hands, and Charlotte hesitated only for a second before following, her steps careful but steady, one hand still resting lightly against her stomach as if grounding herself in something real, something that could not be taken or sold. The hallway was dimmer, lined with framed documents and photographs of past auctions, histories reduced to transactions. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. "My name is Eleanor Ashford," the woman said finally, stopping near a window that overlooked the city lights, and the name itself seemed to carry weight, though Charlotte could not immediately place why. "I have seen that crest before," Eleanor continued, her voice measured, precise. "Not in a catalogue, not in a private collection, but in records that are not meant to be forgotten." Charlotte frowned slightly, confusion deepening, because nothing about her life had ever suggested connections to anything beyond what she had known. "It was just my mother's necklace," she repeated, But even as she said it, the words felt thinner than they had before, like a version of the truth that no longer held its shape. Eleanor turned to face her fully now, her expression no longer observational but certain. "No," she said softly. "It was not just a necklace." And something in the way she said it made the air between them feel tighter, more focused. "That crest belongs to the Ashford lineage," she continued, each word deliberate. "A line that does not disappear, even when it is hidden." Charlotte's breath caught slightly, not because she understood, but because she sensed the direction of what was being said, and it did not align with anything she had believed about herself. "That is not possible," she said, almost instinctively, shaking her head once as if that alone could dismiss the idea. "My mother never said anything about—" She stopped, because she did not even know how to finish the sentence. "Never said anything." About what? About history, about legacy, about something larger than the life they had lived. Eleanor watched her carefully, not with impatience, but with a kind of quiet urgency. "Some truths are not told," she said. "They are protected, sometimes for generations." Charlotte looked back toward the auction hall, where through the open doorway she could still see Daniel moving easily through the crowd, untouched by any of this, and the contrast hit her harder now, because if what Eleanor was suggesting had even a fraction of truth, then everything that had just happened was not just betrayal, it was ignorance. "Why are you telling me this?" Charlotte asked, her voice steadier now, not because she felt stable, but because something inside her was beginning to align, to question instead of retreat. Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "Because the piece that was just sold should never have been placed on that stage," she said. "And because the moment it appeared, it set things in motion. That cannot be reversed." Charlotte felt that again, that subtle shift, not visible to anyone else, but undeniable to her, the sense that she was standing at the edge of something that had been waiting for her long before she ever walked into that room. "Then we get it back," Charlotte said, almost before she realized she was speaking, the words forming with a clarity that surprised even her, and for the first time since this began, Eleanor allowed the faintest hint of approval to show. "It is not that simple," she replied. "But it is no longer impossible." And somewhere behind them, in the distance of the auction hall, another gavel struck, echoing faintly through the corridor like a reminder that some decisions are made in seconds, but their consequences unfold far beyond the moment they are heard. Charlotte did not return to the center of the room right away, but the world did not wait for her to be ready, because by the time she and Eleanor stepped back toward the open hall, the energy had shifted again, quieter on the surface but sharper underneath, like a conversation that had already begun without them, and this time Charlotte noticed the difference, the way certain eyes lingered a second longer, the way a few voices dropped when she passed, as if something about her presence no longer fit the simple narrative they had assigned earlier, and across the room Daniel finally looked up, not at the crowd, not at the auctioneer, but directly at her, and for the first time that night his expression changed, just slightly, not guilt, not concern, but recognition that something had moved beyond his control. "You should have stayed seated," he said when she approached, his tone low, measured, designed to sound reasonable, but Charlotte heard what was beneath it, the assumption that she would comply, that she always had. "I am fine," she replied, and the words came out steadier than she felt, but steadier than he expected, and that alone created a pause between them, small but noticeable. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly to Eleanor, assessing, calculating. "And you are?" he asked, polite but distant, as if she were just another attendee, and Eleanor did not answer immediately. She simply held his gaze long enough to let the silence carry its own weight. "Someone who recognizes when something does not belong on a stage," she said finally, and though her voice remained calm, the effect was immediate, because Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, like a man adjusting to a new variable he had not accounted for. "The piece was legally acquired," he replied, his tone sharpening just enough to reassert control. "And legally sold." Eleanor inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its implication. "Legal does not always mean rightful," she said, and the words did not echo loudly, but they traveled, carried by the stillness that followed, Because even in a room built on transactions there were lines people understood without speaking. Charlotte stood between them, feeling the distance that had always existed now laid bare, not just between her and Daniel, but between what she had believed her life to be and what it might actually represent. "You said everything has a price?" she said, turning her attention back to him, and Daniel's gaze returned to her, sharper now. "It does," he answered, almost automatically, and Charlotte nodded once, slowly. "Then you should know what you just sold," she said, and the words were not loud, but they landed differently than anything she had said before, because this time she was not asking, not pleading, not trying to recover something already lost. She was stating something he had not yet understood, and for a brief second Daniel hesitated. Not visibly enough for most people to notice, but enough for Eleanor to see, enough for Charlotte to feel. "If there is a claim," Daniel began, shifting back into familiar ground, "you can have your attorney contact mine." But Charlotte did not respond to the process, not yet, because something else had already taken hold, a quiet clarity that had not been there even minutes earlier. "I will," she said, but her voice carried something new, something that made the words sound less like a request, and more like a promise, and as she turned slightly, her hand once again resting against her stomach, the movement was not protective this time, it was grounding, deliberate, as if reminding herself of what mattered and what could not be reduced to a transaction. Around them the auction resumed, another item announced, another number called, but the rhythm felt different now, because somewhere within it a new story had begun to unfold. One that did not follow the rules that room depended on. And as Eleanor stepped closer to Charlotte's side, her presence steady and certain, it became clear that whatever had been hidden was no longer willing to remain that way, and Daniel, standing in the same place he had controlled only moments ago, was now part of something he did not yet understand, a shift that had already started long before the gavel fell, and would not end with it. The auctioneer's voice rose again, smooth and practiced, but Charlotte no longer heard the words the same way, because now every number sounded like a challenge, every bid like a reminder of how easily something meaningful could be reduced to a transaction, and as she stood there with Eleanor beside her, the space around them seemed to shift subtly, not in volume but in attention. As if the room itself had begun to sense that something beneath the surface was no longer stable. "We do not have much time," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes scanning the room not with anxiety but with precision. "Who purchased the piece matters more than you think." Charlotte followed her gaze instinctively, searching for the person who had raised the final bid, but the crowd had already begun to rearrange itself, small groups forming and dissolving in practiced patterns, faces blending into one another behind polite smiles and measured gestures. "Do you know who it was?" Charlotte asked, her voice low. And Eleanor did not answer immediately, which was answer enough in itself. "Not yet," she said, "but I know how to find out." And with that she turned slightly, signaling to a man standing near the far wall, someone Charlotte had not noticed before, dressed simply compared to the rest, but carrying himself with a quiet authority that did not require display. He approached without hesitation, leaning in just enough for Eleanor to speak without being overheard, and whatever she said, it was brief, direct, and understood immediately, because he nodded once and disappeared back into the flow of the room without drawing attention. Charlotte watched this exchange carefully, the efficiency of it, the absence of uncertainty, and realized that Eleanor did not operate within the same limits as everyone else here. "You knew this would happen," Charlotte said, not accusing, but observing, and Eleanor shook her head slightly. "I knew something was coming," she corrected. "But not like this, not here." And for the first time there was a hint of something else in her tone, not doubt, but urgency, as if the situation had accelerated beyond expectation. Across the room Daniel had resumed his position near the center, speaking again, but now his attention flickered more frequently, his composure intact but no longer effortless, because control once questioned is never fully regained, and Charlotte saw it, the subtle tightening in his posture, the way his eyes moved more often than before, searching, assessing, recalculating. "He does not understand what he started," Eleanor said, following Charlotte's line of sight, and Charlotte exhaled slowly, feeling that same steady awareness building again, not anger, not yet, but something firmer than before. Neither do I, she admitted, and Eleanor looked at her, not with concern, but with recognition. That will change, she said simply, and in that moment, the man Eleanor had sent returned, moving just as quietly as before, but this time there was a shift in his expression, a subtle confirmation that whatever he had found mattered. He leaned in again, speaking low, and Charlotte caught only fragments, a name, a company, a private acquisition, but the reaction was immediate. Eleanor's posture straightened, her gaze sharpening with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Who is it? Charlotte asked, unable to ignore the tension now building beneath the surface, and Eleanor did not soften the answer. The buyer is connected to Whitmore Holdings, she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that landed instantly. Charlotte's eyes moved back to Daniel, the distance between them suddenly feeling different, because this was no longer just about a sale, it was about intention, about control extending beyond what had been visible. He planned this, Charlotte said, not as a question, and Eleanor did not disagree. Perhaps not the full outcome, she replied, but enough to believe he would benefit. Charlotte felt something settle inside her then, not the confusion that had followed her since the gavel fell, but a clearer understanding of the shape this was taking, because if the piece had been moved intentionally, if it had been redirected through channels that led back to the same hand that let it go, then this was never about value, it was about possession, about keeping something within reach while appearing to release it, and that realization did not overwhelm her, it focused her. Then we do not chase the piece, Charlotte said slowly, the thought forming as she spoke. We follow where it leads. And Eleanor's eyes met hers, steady, assessing, and then, just barely, approving, because in that moment Charlotte was no longer reacting to what had been taken, she was beginning to understand the game that had been set in motion, and more importantly, she was stepping into it on her own terms. The realization did not come with noise but with silence, the kind that settles in after something irreversible has already taken place, and Charlotte felt it clearly now as she stood beneath the soft lights of the auction hall, her gaze steady on Daniel while the truth began to arrange itself into something she could no longer ignore, because this was never about letting go, it was about control dressed as distance. About moving something valuable just far enough to appear gone while ensuring it never truly left his reach, and as that understanding settled, the room itself seemed smaller, more contained, as if every conversation and every movement was part of a structure she was only now beginning to see. He believes he has already secured it, Eleanor said quietly, her voice measured, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now, something that acknowledged the strategy without respecting it. Then he believes wrong, Charlotte replied, and the words surprised even her, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they came, as if something inside her had shifted into place without asking for permission. Across the room Daniel's attention flickered again, landing on her just long enough to register that she had not retreated, that she had not left, and more importantly, that she was no longer reacting the way he expected, and that small disruption began to ripple outward. Subtle but undeniable. We need to move before the transfer is finalized, Eleanor continued, her focus returning to the matter at hand. Once it is processed through their internal channels, it becomes significantly more difficult to challenge. Charlotte nodded once, absorbing the information, but her mind was already moving ahead, not just toward recovery, but toward understanding the full scope of what had been set in motion. Then we do not wait for the transfer, she said, her voice low but firm. We interrupt it. Eleanor studied her for a brief moment, not questioning, but measuring, and then she gave a slight nod, acknowledging the direction. That will require proof, she said. Not assumption, not implication, but something that cannot be dismissed. Charlotte's hand moved again to her stomach, not out of instinct this time, but out of awareness, grounding herself in the only certainty she had carried into this room, and as she did, a memory surfaced, quiet but persistent, something her mother had once said without explanation, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt different, heavier. There was something inside the clasp, Charlotte said slowly, her thoughts aligning as she spoke. I remember it now, a marking, something I never understood. Eleanor's expression sharpened immediately. "Describe it," she said, and Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, recalling the small details she had overlooked for years. "It was not decorative," she said. "It looked intentional, like it was meant to be hidden unless you knew where to look." Eleanor exhaled softly, not in relief, but in confirmation. "That is not a design," she said. "That is a seal." And the word carried weight, more than Charlotte fully grasped, but enough to feel its significance. "If that seal is intact, it changes everything," Eleanor continued. "It establishes origin, legitimacy, and claim." Charlotte opened her eyes, her focus returning to the room. To the man who had just tried to turn something meaningful into something manageable, and for the first time since the gavel fell, she did not feel like she was standing in his world, reacting to his decisions. She felt like she was stepping into something larger, something that had existed long before him and would continue long after. "Then we do not just interrupt the transfer," she said, her voice steady. "We expose it." And Eleanor's gaze held hers, steady, unwavering, and then, just slightly, approving again, because this was no longer about retrieving a piece of jewelry, it was about revealing what it represented, and somewhere in the center of the room Daniel Whitmore stood exactly where he had been all night, surrounded by influence and certainty, unaware that the foundation beneath that certainty had already begun to shift, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that could not be undone once it fully surfaced. The moment Eleanor said the word seal, everything around Charlotte seemed to sharpen into focus, not louder, not brighter, but clearer, like a lens adjusting to reveal details that had always been there but never fully seen, and for the first time that night she understood that what had been taken from her was never meant to be hidden in plain sight, it was meant to be recognized, and more importantly, protected. If the seal is confirmed, the transaction can be legally challenged before completion, Eleanor said, her tone precise, already moving through the implications with practiced efficiency. "But we need access to the piece before it is transferred out of this building." Charlotte nodded slowly, her thoughts aligning with a kind of quiet urgency that did not feel rushed but deliberate, because this was no longer about reacting quickly, it was about acting correctly, and that distinction mattered. "Then we do it here," Charlotte said, her voice low but steady. "Before it leaves the floor." Eleanor did not hesitate this time, she turned immediately, her presence shifting from observer to authority, and signaled again to the man who had been assisting her, who returned within seconds as if he had never truly left. "Delay the release?" she instructed, her voice calm but carrying a weight that did not invite resistance. "Site verification protocol if necessary." The man nodded once and moved without question, disappearing toward the administrative wing behind the stage, and Charlotte watched him go, recognizing now that this was no longer a private matter, it was becoming something visible, something that would not stay contained within quiet conversations. Across the room the auctioneer paused briefly, conferring with a staff member, and though the disruption was subtle, it was enough to shift the rhythm of the room again, because in places like this, even a small interruption signals something larger beneath the surface. Daniel noticed it immediately, his attention snapping toward the stage, then toward Charlotte, then toward Eleanor, the calculation in his expression returning but no longer effortless, because this was no longer part of his design. "What are you doing?" he asked when he approached again, his tone controlled but tighter now, and Charlotte turned to face him fully, no longer stepping back, no longer softening her presence. "Correcting a mistake," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it did not explain, it did not justify, it simply stated, and that was enough to unsettle him more than any argument would have. "There is no mistake," Daniel said, his voice sharpening just slightly. "The piece was authenticated and processed." Eleanor stepped forward then, her gaze meeting his with a calm certainty that did not need to raise its volume. "Not fully," she said. "Not where it matters." And for a moment the space between them held, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, because this was no longer a private disagreement, it was a question of legitimacy unfolding in a room built on perceived certainty. "You are interrupting a legal transaction," Daniel replied, But the statement lacked the finality it had earlier, because now it sounded like a position he was trying to maintain rather than one he fully controlled. "We are verifying it," Eleanor corrected, and the distinction landed clearly, because verification implies the possibility of error, and error in a place like this is not just inconvenient, it is consequential. Charlotte felt it then, the shift reaching beyond her, beyond Daniel, into the structure of the room itself, because now others were watching more closely, conversations slowing, attention narrowing, and for the first time since she had walked in, she was not the one being observed as an outsider, she was part of something that was changing the space around her. And as the staff member returned to the stage, whispering to the auctioneer, who then raised his hand to pause the proceedings, the room responded with a quiet ripple of confusion and curiosity, and Charlotte stood still in the center of it, her hand resting lightly against her stomach, her posture steady, her gaze forward, because whatever came next was no longer something happening to her, it was something she was now fully part of, and there was no turning back from that. The pause did not come with an announcement, it came with absence, the sudden stop of motion in a room that depended on constant flow, and when the auctioneer lowered his hand the silence that followed felt heavier than any sound that had filled it before, because now every person in that room understood that something was not proceeding as expected, and uncertainty in a place built on certainty carries its own kind of gravity. Charlotte did not move, she did not look around to measure reactions or search for reassurance, she simply stood where she was, grounded and still, as if she had already accepted that whatever happened next would define more than just this moment. Beside her, Eleanor remained composed, her attention fixed not on the crowd but on the stage where a small group of staff members had gathered around the display case that had once held the necklace, their movements controlled but purposeful. And within seconds one of them returned carrying the piece, not presented, not displayed, but held carefully as if its status had already changed from object to evidence. Daniel saw it too, and this time he did not hide the shift in his expression. It was subtle, contained, but present, the first clear sign that control was no longer entirely his. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice lower now, directed not at Charlotte but at Eleanor, as if addressing her might restore some balance to the situation, but Eleanor did not respond to the tone. She responded to the moment, stepping forward just enough to meet the approaching staff member, her gaze focused entirely on the necklace as it was placed onto a small inspection tray. The room watched without speaking, without moving closer, but with an attention that had sharpened into something collective, because this was no longer just a transaction, it was a question unfolding in real time. "Open the clasp," Eleanor said, and the instruction was not loud, but it carried clearly, because silence amplifies intention. The staff member hesitated only briefly before complying, using a small tool to release the mechanism, and as the clasp opened, the light shifted slightly across the surface, revealing what had always been there but never acknowledged, a marking, precise and deliberate, hidden in plain sight, and Charlotte felt it before she fully saw it. A recognition that did not come from knowledge but from something deeper, something that aligned with the memory she had just uncovered. "There," Eleanor said, her voice steady, and though she did not raise it, the word carried through the room, because now there was something to see, something undeniable. The staff member leaned closer, adjusting the angle, and even from where she stood Charlotte could make out the detail, not decorative, not ornamental, but intentional, a seal pressed into metal with purpose, and as the realization spread, not loudly but steadily, the room responded in the only way it could, with silence that acknowledged significance. Daniel stepped forward then, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a controlled urgency that had replaced his earlier composure. "That does not change ownership," he said, but the statement lacked the certainty it once held, because now it was no longer supported by assumption, it was being challenged by evidence. Eleanor did not look at him when she replied, her focus remained on the seal, on the confirmation it provided. "It changes everything," she said, and this time there was no need for explanation, because the weight of the moment carried its own meaning. Charlotte stood just behind her, her posture steady, her presence no longer uncertain or reactive, but aligned with something that had been hidden until now, and as the room absorbed what was being revealed, as the balance shifted from transaction to truth, it became clear that the gavel had not ended anything. It had only begun something that could not be contained once it was seen, and in that stillness, in that quiet recognition, the story that had been written for Charlotte without her consent was no longer the one being told. No one spoke at first because there was nothing left to debate. The seal did not argue, it did not explain, it simply existed, precise and undeniable under the light, and the longer it remained visible the heavier the silence became, as if every person in that room was recalculating what they had just witnessed, not as spectators but as participants in something that had shifted beyond expectation. Charlotte took a step forward then, not rushed, not hesitant, but measured, her eyes fixed on the small marking that had turned a simple transaction into something far more consequential, and as she moved closer the details became clearer, the lines sharper, the shape unmistakable even to someone who had only just begun to understand its meaning. "That seal is registered," Eleanor said, her voice calm but carrying further now because the room had nothing else to hold on to. "Not in private collections, not in auction records, but in legal archives that define lineage and claim." A murmur moved through the crowd, subtle but present, because those words did not belong in a place like this, they belonged in courtrooms, in institutions where proof carried weight beyond price. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the shift small but visible now, because this was no longer a matter of control through process, it was a matter of legitimacy through evidence. "You are making assumptions based on a symbol," he said, but the tone had changed, less assured, more defensive, and Eleanor finally turned her gaze toward him fully, not confrontational, not raised, but steady in a way that did not leave room for dismissal. "No," she replied. "I am recognizing a claim that predates everything in this room." And that was the moment the balance shifted completely, because time, not money, had entered the conversation, and time carries authority that cannot be purchased or redirected. Charlotte felt it then, not as pressure, but as clarity, because for the first time she was not trying to understand what had been taken from her, she was understanding what it had always meant. "What does it prove?" Charlotte asked, her voice steady, not questioning the truth but defining its reach, and Eleanor answered without hesitation. "It proves origin, it proves continuity, and most importantly it proves that this piece cannot be separated from the person it belongs to without recognition of that claim." The words settled into the room with a weight that did not require repetition, because now the conversation had moved beyond ownership into something deeper, something structured, and the staff members near the stage exchanged brief glances, not speaking, but clearly aware that what had been routine moments ago was now subject to something they were not prepared to override. Daniel stepped closer, not aggressively, but with a controlled urgency that no longer masked itself as composure. "Even if that were true," he began, "it does not invalidate the sale." But the sentence did not land the way he intended, because the room had already begun to question the foundation beneath it. Eleanor's response was immediate, not louder, but sharper in its precision. "It does not invalidate the sale," she said. "It invalidates the assumption that the seller had the authority to release it without disclosure." And that distinction cut cleanly through everything that had come before, because authority is not implied, it is established, and in that moment it was clear that what had been missing was not value, but recognition. Charlotte stood beside her, not behind, not uncertain, but present in a way she had not been earlier, and as she looked at Daniel now there was no confusion left. Only understanding, not just of what he had done, but of what he had failed to see. "You thought it was just an object," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the stillness, and Daniel did not respond immediately, because for the first time that night he did not have a position ready, not one that could hold against what was now visible, and that pause, brief but undeniable, said more than anything else could, because in a room where everything moved quickly, hesitation meant loss of control, and as the silence settled again, heavier this time, more defined, it became clear that the transaction had not ended when the gavel fell, it had only revealed what should never have been overlooked, and Charlotte, standing at the center of it, was no longer the one being displaced. She was the one redefining what could not be taken without consequence. The shift was no longer subtle, it was structural, And everyone in that room felt it even if they could not fully explain it, because what had started as a routine auction had become something else entirely, something that did not belong to price lists or bidding paddles, but to recognition, to authority, to a truth that could not be negotiated once it was seen. And Charlotte stood in the center of it with a stillness that no longer came from uncertainty but from control, not the kind Daniel understood, not the kind built on ownership and influence, but something quieter and far more stable, the kind that does not need to assert itself because it already exists. "We will need documentation," one of the senior staff members said carefully, stepping forward with a tone that balanced caution and obligation, because now the responsibility had shifted to them, and they could no longer proceed as if nothing had changed. Eleanor nodded once, not surprised, not resistant, as if this step had always been part of the outcome. "You will have it," she said, her voice calm but absolute. "The Ashford Registry is not difficult to access when you know where to look." The name carried through the room again, not loudly, but with growing recognition, because now it was no longer just a suggestion, it was a reference, something that existed beyond the walls of this building, something verifiable. Daniel exhaled slowly, a controlled movement, but one that revealed more than he intended. Because this was the first moment he had to respond to something outside his design. "Even if such a registry exists," he said, choosing his words more carefully now, "it does not automatically grant standing in this transaction." Charlotte turned to him then, her gaze steady, not challenging, not emotional, but clear. "It does when the item was never yours to release without disclosure," she said, and this time there was no hesitation, no softness, just a statement that aligned with everything that had just been revealed, and for a moment Daniel said nothing, not because he agreed, but because he understood that the room was no longer aligned with him, that the weight of attention had shifted, and once that happens, influence begins to fracture. Eleanor stepped closer to the inspection table, her focus returning to the necklace, to the seal that had changed everything. "This is not just identification," she said, her voice carrying now without effort. "It is a legal marker of continuity, one that binds the object to a lineage that cannot be separated without acknowledgement." The staff member nodded slowly, absorbing the implication, and Charlotte could see it, the moment when procedure gives way to responsibility, when following steps is no longer enough because the situation demands understanding. "Then the transfer is suspended," the staff member said finally, not loudly, but with a firmness that settled into the room, because this was the first official action taken in response to what had been revealed, and it changed everything. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind that searches for an alternative path when the original one collapses. "On what grounds?" he asked, and the question was not rhetorical, it was strategic. But this time the answer did not come from Eleanor, it came from the staff member. "On the grounds that the item requires verification of origin and rightful claim before completion of sale." The response was measured, professional, but final in a way that could not be easily redirected. Charlotte felt it then, the moment when something that had been taken was no longer beyond reach, not yet returned, not yet resolved, but no longer lost, and that distinction mattered, because it marked the point where the story changed direction, where what had been done to her was no longer the defining force. "This is not over," Daniel said quietly, not as a threat, but as a statement, and Charlotte met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "It is just beginning." And there was no need to say more, because the room had already shifted, the process had already changed, and whatever came next would not follow the path he had set, it would follow something older, something established long before he ever believed he could control it. And as the necklace remained on the table, no longer an item for sale, but a piece of proof waiting to be recognized, Charlotte stood beside it, not reaching for it, not claiming it with urgency, but acknowledging it with certainty. Because for the first time that night, she was not trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, she was standing in front of something that could no longer be taken without consequence. The word suspended did not echo, but it settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because in a space built on completion, interruption carries its own kind of authority, and Charlotte could feel it in the way the air seemed to shift, the way conversations no longer resumed as easily, the way attention remained fixed not on the next item but on what had just been stopped, and as she stood there, her gaze steady on the necklace resting under the light, she realized something that had not been clear before. This was not just about reclaiming what had been taken, it was about revealing what had been hidden, and once revealed, it could not be unseen. Eleanor moved first, not toward Daniel, not toward the staff, but toward Charlotte, closing the small distance between them with a quiet certainty that did not require urgency. "There will be questions now," she said, her voice low, meant only for Charlotte. "And not all of them will be asked in this room." Charlotte nodded, understanding the implication without needing further explanation, because the moment something leaves the control of one person, it becomes subject to many, and that shift brings scrutiny that cannot be contained. Across the room Daniel remained still, but not unchanged, the stillness now deliberate, controlled in a way that suggested he was no longer reacting but recalibrating, and Charlotte saw it clearly. The way his focus had narrowed, the way his attention no longer moved freely, but with intention, because now he was no longer managing a situation, he was navigating one. "You could end this here," Daniel said finally, his voice even, directed at Charlotte rather than Eleanor, and that alone marked a change, because he was no longer dismissing her presence, he was addressing it. "Withdraw the claim, allow the process to complete, and we move forward." The offer was simple on the surface, but beneath it was something else, a return to familiarity, to control, to a version of events where nothing had truly changed, and for a moment the room held its breath again, not because they expected her to accept, but because they understood the weight of what was being offered. Charlotte did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because she was measuring the distance between what he was saying and what had already been revealed, and the gap between those two things was no longer something she could ignore. "Move forward to where?" she asked quietly, and the question did not challenge him, it exposed the absence in his statement. Because forward only has meaning when direction is clear. Daniel's expression remained composed, but there was a pause now, a fraction of a second where the answer did not come as easily as before. "To resolution," he said, but the word lacked definition, it floated without structure, and Charlotte felt it, the difference between something that sounds complete and something that actually is. "This is the resolution," she replied, her voice steady, not raised, not forceful, but certain in a way that did not require reinforcement, because she was no longer looking for an outcome, she was standing in one. Eleanor watched the exchange without interruption, her presence steady, allowing Charlotte to define the moment in her own terms, and that was the shift that mattered most, not the seal, not the suspension, but the fact that Charlotte was no longer responding to what had been done to her, she was defining what came next. The staff near the stage began to move again, not resuming the auction, but adjusting to the new reality, documents being requested, calls being placed, processes shifting from completion to verification, and with each small movement the structure of the room continued to change, because once a system is questioned, it cannot return to what it was before. Daniel exhaled slowly, the control still present, but no longer absolute. "Then we proceed differently," he said, and this time it was not a statement of control, it was an acknowledgement of change. Charlotte met his gaze, not with resistance, not with emotion, but with clarity. "We already are," she said, and in that moment there was nothing left to negotiate, because the direction had already shifted, the process had already changed, and the balance that had once defined the room was no longer in place, and as Charlotte stood there, steady and grounded, with the weight of the past no longer pulling her backward but aligning her forward, it became clear that whatever came next would not be determined by who had held control before, but by what had now been brought into the light, something older, something undeniable, something that did not ask for permission to be recognized. What followed did not feel like escalation, it felt like recognition, the kind that unfolds slowly but completely, and as the room adjusted to the new direction, the presence of authority began to take a different form, not louder, not more visible, but more grounded, more deliberate, because now every action carried weight beyond the immediate moment. The staff who had once moved with routine efficiency were now operating with measured caution, verifying, documenting, confirming, and with each step the distance between what had been assumed and what was now known continued to widen. Charlotte remained where she was, not because she needed to hold her place, but because she understood that movement now meant intention, and intention meant consequence. Eleanor stood beside her, not guiding, not directing, but present in a way that allowed Charlotte to occupy the moment fully, without interruption, without interference. "The registry will confirm within minutes," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady. "And once it does, the claim will not just be recognized, it will be enforced." Charlotte absorbed the words without reacting outwardly, because something inside her had already settled into alignment, a quiet certainty that did not need reinforcement. Across the room Daniel had shifted again, not physically, but in focus, his attention no longer scanning, no longer calculating in broad strokes, but narrowing, refining, searching for the exact point where control could still be re-established, and that shift was visible now, not just to Charlotte, but to others as well, because control, once fractured, leaves traces. "You are relying on something that has not yet been confirmed," Daniel said, his tone measured, but there was an edge beneath it now, not frustration, but urgency contained. "And you are continuing as if it has already changed everything." Charlotte turned to him, not sharply, not defensively, but with a calm that did not match the tension in the room. "It has," she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because the change was not dependent on confirmation, it was dependent on recognition, and that had already happened. The staff member returned then, moving quickly but without haste, a tablet in hand, and the moment he reached Eleanor the room seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough to create a space where what was about to be said would not be lost. He spoke softly. But the effect was immediate. Eleanor's posture straightened slightly. Not in surprise, but in confirmation. "It matches," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the words carried. "The seal is registered to the Ashford lineage, and the continuity is intact." The statement did not echo, it settled, and as it did, the final layer of uncertainty fell away, because now what had been suggested was verified, what had been recognized was recorded, and what had been questioned was resolved. Daniel did not respond immediately, and that silence, more than anything else, marked the shift that had fully taken place, because for the first time that night there was nothing left for him to reinterpret, nothing left to reposition. The framework had changed, and he was no longer the one defining it. Charlotte felt it then, not as relief, not as victory, but as clarity, the kind that does not rush, does not overwhelm, but simply exists, steady and undeniable. "Then the claim stands," the staff member said, his voice professional, but carrying a new level of certainty. "And the transfer will not proceed without formal recognition of that claim." Charlotte nodded once, not because she needed to agree, but because she understood that this was the moment where process aligned with truth, where structure acknowledged what had already been revealed. Eleanor looked at her briefly, not with instruction, but with acknowledgement, and in that glance there was something unspoken, something that confirmed Charlotte was no longer stepping into something unfamiliar. She was standing within something that had always been hers, and as the room adjusted once more, not returning to what it had been, but settling into what it had become, it was clear that nothing about this night would continue as planned, not for the auction, not for Daniel, and not for Charlotte, because what had been hidden was now established, and once established, it does not return to silence. No one applauded, no one spoke, because moments like this do not invite noise, they demand recognition, and Charlotte stood in the center of that recognition with a stillness that no longer belonged to uncertainty but to completion, not the kind that ends something, but the kind that reveals what has already been decided long before anyone in that room believed they were in control. The necklace remained on the table, no longer an item, no longer a transaction, but a statement, and the seal within it had done what no voice in that room could have done. It had shifted the truth into view and left it there without permission to be ignored. The staff moved with quiet precision now, not rushing, not hesitating, but carrying out what had become inevitable: documentation prepared, processes redirected, authority re-established where it had once been assumed, and as each step unfolded, the distance between what Daniel had intended and what had actually occurred became impossible to reconcile. He stood where he had been for most of the evening, but nothing about that position held the same weight anymore, because the room no longer moved around him. It moved around something else, something older, something established, something that could not be reshaped by influence or timing. Charlotte looked at him then, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, and in that gaze there was no anger, no demand, only clarity. The kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. You tried to define the outcome before understanding the origin, she said quietly, and the words did not challenge him, they completed the moment. Daniel did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because nothing he could say would change what had already been established, and that silence was not defeat, it was recognition, the kind that arrives too late to alter the course but early enough to be understood. Eleanor remained beside Charlotte, not as a guide, not as a shield, but as a witness, someone who had seen this before, not the exact moment, but the pattern of it, the way truth surfaces when it is no longer contained. It will be returned to you through proper channels, one of the staff members said, his tone respectful now, no longer procedural, and Charlotte nodded once, not out of relief, but out of acknowledgement, because the return itself was no longer the point. What mattered had already been restored, the recognition, the legitimacy, the truth that could not be overlooked again. Her hand rested lightly against her stomach, the movement calm, deliberate, grounding her in something that extended beyond the room, beyond the moment, into a future that would not be shaped by what had almost been lost. She turned then, not dramatically, not slowly, but with a quiet certainty that marked the end of something that had never truly belonged to her and the beginning of something that always had. And as she walked away, the room did not follow, it did not call her back, it remained where it was, adjusting, recalibrating, continuing in a way that would never fully return to what it had been before. Daniel watched her go, not with interruption, not with pursuit, but with an understanding that settled in the absence of control, because for the first time that night, he was no longer the one deciding what happened next, and Charlotte did not look back. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required her attention. The silence that followed her departure was not empty, it was complete, the kind that carries its own conclusion without needing to announce it, and somewhere in that stillness, beneath the quiet and the shifting structure of the room, one truth remained clear: some men lose everything they believed they owned, just to understand what they were never meant to hold.